The bodies did not stay dead, and that was what drove most of the village away before Ronan Vorn ever arrived. Not the sickness, not the smell, but what came after, when those who had already been buried began to move again beneath the soil, not rising fully, not walking, but shifting just enough for the ground above them to change. And when he reached the outskirts, the first thing he noticed was the silence. No animals, no insects, no sound of life anywhere near the place, as if whatever had taken hold here had driven everything else out, and the air itself felt wrong, heavier than it should have been, carrying a damp, sour scent that clung to the back of his throat with every breath. And Ronan stepped forward without hesitation, his boots sinking slightly into the softened earth as he moved between the abandoned houses. The doors left open, the windows dark, the signs of departure rushed, not planned, and the smell grew stronger with each step. Not just decay, not just rot, but something active, something that continued rather than ended, and he found the first body near the well. Not fresh, not newly dead, but not fully gone either. The skin discolored the flesh, sunken in places, but the structure still intact, and as he stepped closer, the chest moved. Not a breath, not life, but a slow, uneven shift, as if something inside it pushed against what remained, and Ronan did not touch it. He had seen enough to understand this was not a simple disease, not something that spread through blood or air. This was something that took hold of what was left after death, something that used the body even when life was gone. A faint, wet sound came then from the direction of the fields beyond the village. A slow, dragging motion, followed by a dull, hollow impact, and Ronan turned toward it immediately, his hand moving to the hilt of his blade, because that sound did not belong to something that lay still. It belonged to something that moved with weight, with purpose. And he followed it without pause, stepping past the last of the houses and into the open land where the crops had long since withered, the ground uneven and dark in patches, where the soil had turned soft and broken. And as he crossed into it, the smell intensified, thick and suffocating, the source of it, no longer distant, but close enough to feel. And then he saw them, figures scattered across the field, not standing, not walking, but partially risen from the ground, their bodies caught halfway between burial and emergence, their limbs shifting slowly, as if pulled upward by something beneath them. The movement, uneven, not coordinated but constant. And Ronan slowed slightly, his gaze narrowing as he studied them. Because this was not random. This was not the result of decay or natural change. This was controlled something beneath the surface pulled at them, used them in the same way. A hand might move fingers, testing their range, their strength, and the ground ahead shifted. Then a deeper movement that ran beneath several of the bodies at once, the soil rising in a slow, deliberate wave before settling again. And Ronan stepped back, half a pace, creating distance, because whatever moved beneath that field was not small, not contained to a single point. It spread through the ground itself, and the bodies reacted to it immediately, their movements tightening their limbs, lifting higher, their forms straining upward, as if responding to a signal. And the realization settled cold and immediate. This was not a collection of corpses. This was a single presence extended through many forms, something that lived within the rot itself, that used what had been left behind to move, to reach, to act above the surface without ever fully revealing itself. And the sound came again, then louder, closer. a deep, wet, dragging motion followed by a heavy impact as the ground split open ahead of him, the soil breaking apart in a jagged line as something forced its way upward. Not quickly, not violently, but with slow, unstoppable pressure. And the shape that emerged was larger than the others. Not separate, not whole, but formed from them pieces of bodies fused together by the same dark rot that filled the ground. Limbs overlapping torsos, pressed together into a single mass that moved as one, and as it rose, the bodies around it shifted in response, their movement aligning their positions, adjusting as if they were part of it, even when they were not directly connected. And Ronan Raven tightened his grip on the blade, because now he understood this was not something that could be cut down, piece by piece, not something that would weaken as it lost parts. This was something that grew from what it took, something that spread through the dead and used them to become more, and whatever had risen from that field was only the beginning of what lay beneath it. The mass did not rush him after it rose, and that alone made it worse, because anything that moved like this did not need speed. It relied on reach, on presence, on the way it could control the space around it without committing fully. And Ronan held his ground. As it settled into shape, the fused bodies shifting slightly, as the rot bound them together, tightening, where needed reinforcing the structure, in ways that did not follow any natural pattern, and the figures around it reacted immediately. Their movement aligning with its presence, their limbs lifting higher, their forms pulling against the earth, as if the thing at the center drew them upward. And that told him enough. They were not separate. They were extensions of it, parts that could act independently, but only within the reach of whatever filled them. A low, wet sound came from the mass. Then not a voice, not anything shaped into words, but something deeper, something that carried through the ground itself. And Ronan felt it through his boots, a vibration that ran outward from the creature into the soil. And the bodies around it responded instantly, their movement sharpening their limbs, breaking free from the ground, more completely as they began to drag themselves forward toward him and Ronan. Step to the side, immediately forcing the angle to change, forcing the line of movement to shift, because anything that relied on direction could be disrupted if the path changed too quickly. And the nearest body lunged at him. Then its movement sudden and uneven, its limbs snapping forward with more strength than its decayed form should have held, and he turned into it, his blade cutting across its arm and through its shoulder, the steel biting deep enough to sever the limb, and the body collapsed to the ground. But even as it fell, it did not go still. The remaining parts of it continued to move, dragging themselves forward, as if the loss meant nothing, as if the rot within it carried enough of the whole to keep it active, and that confirmed it. Cutting them down would not end them, not in the way it should. The mass at the center shifted, then its form expanding slightly as more of the surrounding bodies were drawn toward it. The rot pulling them closer, the connection between them tightening, and Ronan saw it clearly. The way the pieces moved, not randomly, not loosely, but in response to a single source. The center controlled everything. The outer bodies only acted as long as they remained within its reach, and that was the weakness, not the limbs, not the structure, but the source of that control. The creature advanced, then not with speed, but with weight. its movement pressing the ground down beneath it, the fused bodies grinding against each other as it dragged itself forward, and the bodies around it followed their movements. More coordinated now, more aggressive, as if the closer it came, the stronger their connection became, and Ronan moved constantly. His steps measured his blade ready, because allowing them to close the distance fully would leave him with no space to act. The first strike from the mass came without warning, one of the fused limbs snapping outward with enough force to break through the soil where it had been half buried. And Ronan stepped back, just in time, the blow striking the ground where he had stood, sending fragments of dirt outward, and he responded immediately, stepping in instead of away, his blade cutting into the extended limb, the steel biting deep. But the resistance was wrong, not flesh, not bone, but something thicker, something that held the structure together, even as it decayed, and he pulled back before it could close around the blade. Because now he understood. This thing did not rely on what remained of the bodies. It used them as material. But what drove them was something else, something that spread through them equally regardless of their condition. The mass pulled the limb back, then the damaged section shifting slightly, as the surrounding parts compensated the structure already adapting to the loss, and the bodies around him pressed in closer, their movements overlapping. Now their attacks less controlled, but more relentless, as if the influence from the center had increased with proximity. And Ronan stepped back again, angling away from the densest cluster, forcing them to follow, forcing them to stretch their formation thinner, because anything that spread like this could be weakened if it was forced to extend too far from its source. The ground behind him shifted, then softer than before, less stable, as the rot had taken deeper hold there, and he adjusted his path, immediately moving toward firmer ground, where his footing would not fail. Because losing balance here would mean being dragged down into the same soil that fed the thing he fought. The mass followed without hesitation, its movement slower but inevitable, its reach extending through the bodies that surrounded it. And the realization settled deeper. This was not a creature that chased it. Advanced, it consumed space gradually until there was nowhere left to stand. And the longer it remained, the stronger it became. The more of the ground it claimed, the more bodies it could use, and the more control it exerted over everything within its reach. And Ronan Vorn tightened his grip on the blade, because now he knew this would not be a fight he could win by cutting through what stood in front of him. The source lay within that mass, within whatever spread through it. And if he did not reach it, if he did not destroy what controlled the rot itself, this place would not remain contained. It would spread beyond the field, beyond the village, until nothing living remained to stop it. The ground softened with every step Ronan took, and that was when he understood the true extent of it. This was not confined to the bodies, not limited to what had already been taken. The rot had spread into the soil itself, into the roots beneath the surface, into everything that could hold it. And as he moved, the earth responded, not collapsing, not breaking, but shifting slightly, as if it recognized the weight above it, and adjusted in response. The bodies around him pressed closer, their movement sharper now, more controlled, as if the distance between them and the central mass had strengthened their connection, and one lunged at him from the side, its arm snapping forward with unnatural force, and Ronan turned into it, his blade cutting through the limb and into the torso, the steel splitting it apart. But even as it fell, the remaining half of the body continued to drag itself forward, the rot within it driving motion where there should have been none. And he stepped back, immediately creating space, because this was no longer a matter of individual threats. This was an environment that acted as one. The mass at the center advanced again. Then its movement slow but unstoppable, the fused bodies grinding against each other as it pulled itself forward, and the ground beneath it sank slightly under the weight, as if the soil itself had begun to give way under its presence. And Ronan saw it clearly now. The pattern in the movement, the way the bodies closest to it moved more precisely, more effectively, while those further away lagged slightly, less coordinated, less stable, and that confirmed the truth. The further the rot spread from its source, the weaker its control became, and that meant the core lay within that central mass, not separate, not hidden beneath the ground, but embedded within it, the point from which everything else extended. And if that could be reached, if that could be destroyed, the rest would collapse. The mass surged forward again. Then one of its limbs extending outward with a heavy sweeping motion that forced Ronan to move back quickly, the impact striking the ground with enough force to break the surface, the soil tearing open and revealing the darker layer beneath, thick with decay, thick with the same substance that held the bodies together, and the smell that rose from it was stronger now, almost suffocating, and Ronan felt the effect of it immediately. Not weakness, not sickness, but pressure, as if the air itself had grown heavier, harder, to draw into his lungs. And that was the second truth. This thing did not just move through the dead. It changed the space around it. It made the air itself part of its reach. The bodies pressed in again. Then, from multiple angles, their attacks overlapping their movements, driven by the same central will. And Ronan moved through them with increasing urgency, his blade cutting down the nearest one, then the next, each strike clearing just enough space for another step forward, because he could not afford to remain at a distance, not while the ground itself was turning against him, not while the air thickened with every second. And he stepped closer to the mass, forcing the distance closed, despite the pressure, despite the way the soil shifted beneath him. Because now he understood this would not end unless he reached it, unless he broke the core that fed everything else. The mass reacted immediately, its movement changing from slow advance to direct engagement, the fused bodies shifting into a more compact form, the outer layers pulling tighter, as if reinforcing the structure as it prepared to meet him. And Ronan saw it. Then, within the mass, not a shape, not something that stood apart, but a point where the movement originated, where the rot pulsed more strongly than anywhere else. A darker section beneath the surface, where the bodies were packed tighter, where the control came from. And that was the target. The only thing that mattered, the mass struck. Then, its limbs snapping forward in a tight, controlled arc, aimed to catch him before he could reach it. And Ronan stepped inside the motion, instead of away, his blade deflecting the strike, just enough to pass, as he drove forward, his body colliding with the outer layer, the impact forcing him against the shifting mass, and the surface moved beneath him, the bodies adjusting as if trying to pull him in to absorb him into the structure. And he reacted instantly, driving his blade forward into the center. Not at the surface, not at the outer layers, but at that darker point where the movement pulsed strongest, and the steel met resistance, unlike anything before. Not solid, not soft, but something that pushed back against it from within, as if it were alive in a way the rest was not, and he forced it deeper, twisting hard, driving through that resistance, as the entire mass convulsed the bodies around him, losing alignment for a fraction of a second, the connection faltering, and Ronan held it there, just long enough to feel the change before pulling back, because he knew it would not end with one strike. Not here, not yet. The mass recovered quickly, though the outer layers shifting to cover the exposed section, the darker core already retreating deeper into the structure, as if it had learned from the strike, as if it understood what he had found, and that confirmed the final truth. This thing adapted not just in movement, not just in structure, but in defense. It would not expose that weakness again, not willingly, and that meant the next moment would be his only chance to reach it completely, before it sealed itself beyond his reach, and became something that could no longer be killed by any means he had. And Ronan Vorn tightened his grip on the blade, his stance lowering as the pressure around him grew heavier. The bodies closing in once more, the mass preparing to strike again. Because now the fight had reached its end, and whatever happened next would decide whether this thing remained, contained in the dead field, or spread beyond it, into everything that still lived. Ronan did not fall back after that, because retreat would only give the mass time to bury its core deeper, to spread further into the ground, until there was no place left to stand and no way left to reach it. So he stepped forward instead, closing the distance again before the outer layers could fully seal the weakness. He had exposed his blade low, his movement direct, forcing the creature to react before it could complete its adjustment, and the mass responded immediately. Its structure tightening, the fused bodies pulling inward, as if reinforcing the center, while the outer limbs lashed out in overlapping strikes, meant to hold him at a distance long enough for the core to disappear from reach, and Ronan moved through them without hesitation, his blade deflecting, one cutting through another, stepping inside the arc of a third, because this was no longer a fight of exchanges. It was a single motion that had to be completed, or not at all. The ground beneath him shifted again, softer now, less stable, as the rot spread deeper, the soil giving slightly under his weight, as if trying to pull him down into it, and he forced himself forward, regardless his footing uneven, but controlled, because stopping here would mean being taken the same way. The others had been, and the mass surged to meet him. Its movement heavier now, more focused, its limbs striking in tighter arcs, aimed not just to hit, but to block his path to close the distance before he could reach the center again. And Ronan turned into it at the last possible moment, letting one strike glance past him, close enough to tear through his coat as he drove forward, inside its reach, his shoulder colliding with the outer. Layer the impact, forcing him into the shifting mass, as the surface moved beneath him, the bodies pressing inward as if trying to absorb him into the structure, and he did not resist it. He used it, stepping deeper into it instead of away, his blade rising in a short, precise motion, aimed directly at the darker point, within where the movement pulsed strongest. And this time, he did not stop when the resistance came. He forced the steel deeper, pushing through the outer layers, through the shifting reinforcement, and into the core itself. And the reaction was immediate, violent, the entire mass convulsing, the bodies losing alignment as the connection faltered, and Ronan held his ground, ignoring the way the surrounding forms collapsed inward around him, ignoring the pressure that pushed against his chest, his arms, his legs, because if he let go now, it would recover. It would adapt. It would spread further than it already had. So he twisted the blade hard, driving it deeper into that pulsing center. And something broke. Not gradually, not partially, but completely. The force that held everything together collapsing in an instant. The movement of the mass stuttering, then failing the bodies around him. Losing cohesion as the rot that drove them lost its source. And he ripped the blade free, stepping back as the structure began to collapse. The fused forms separating where they had been held together. The limbs falling away, the ground beneath them shifting violently, as the control that had spread through it vanished. And for a moment, everything moved at once, the field breaking apart, the soil sinking in places, as the rot that had filled it lost its hold. And then it stopped, the motion ending as suddenly as it had begun, the bodies lying still where they fell, no longer moving, no longer connected, the ground settling back into place. The unnatural softness fading as the structure beneath it failed, and Ronan stepped back again. His breathing steady, despite the weight of the air that still lingered for a moment, before beginning to clear, because he needed to be certain, needed to see that nothing remained, that nothing still moved beneath the surface, and there was nothing, no shifting, no pulling, no sign that the rot still lived. The field lay quiet, empty, in a way it had not been when he arrived, the presence that had filled it. Gone completely and slowly, he lowered his blade, turning away from it. As the wind moved across the open land again, the scent of decay fading with it. And as he walked back toward the village, the silence that had once felt wrong began to change, becoming something natural again, something that belonged to a place where nothing hunted from beneath the ground. And Ronan Raven did not look back, because there was nothing left there to watch him, nothing left that could follow or spread, without the core that had driven it. And for now, that was enough. The rot had been contained. The dead would remain still. And whatever had created it, whatever had allowed something like this to exist, would have to begin again somewhere else if it ever did. And Ronan knew better than to believe it would not, because things like this did not end. They were stopped, delayed, broken at their source, until something else found a way to bring them back. And when that happened, he would be there again, standing where the ground first began to move, and the silence first began to change.